Okay, now we're going to put the two pieces of the model together and look at long-run equilibrium and how it determines the price level. So for the economy as a whole, long-run equilibrium is just when the aggregate demand curve intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve. Very similar to our supply and demand model in Chapter 3. So graphically, this is really simple. We just find where our aggregate demand curve and long-run aggregate supply curve intersect, and that tells us where long-run equilibrium is. Right, so this is exactly what it might look like, right? So what do we see here? We see that the economy is in long-run equilibrium at a price level of 120, so that's the price index, probably a GDP deflator, since that's the most broad price index. And in equilibrium, the economy is producing $18 trillion worth of final goods and services. Now, the economy isn't necessarily in equilibrium. It could be in disequilibrium. So the economy might be experiencing a price level of 140, in which case we would basically have a surplus of products, right? And then over time, as the economy adjusted, prices would have to decrease so that that surplus of goods and services would disappear. And then if we were at a lower price level, a price level of 100, we'd basically have a shortage, right? There wouldn't be enough goods and services available to satiate consumer demand or aggregate demand. And so over the long run, prices would slowly increase so that that shortage disappeared. All right, so now we want to think about what are the effects of economic growth on the price level. So as we saw in the first section, economic growth is just the long-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. Basically, when that happens, I encourage you actually, why don't you pause the video, draw yourself a graph that looks like this, and see what happens as you shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. What do you predict will happen to the price level? Okay, so hopefully you drew it out and you determined that as economic growth takes place, the price level actually goes down, right? And so when that happens, when we have deflation that's the result of economic growth, we call that secular deflation. Okay, so it's this persistent deflation, persistent decline in prices that result from economic growth in the presence of stable aggregate demand. So we are, of course, assuming that aggregate demand is not changing. So if aggregate demand is stable and we have economic growth, then we will get a decline in prices that is persistent, and we refer to that as secular deflation. So what we basically are looking at is that an increase in long-run aggregate supply, which equates to economic growth, ceteris paribus, holding everything else the same, will result in a decrease in the price level. And again, we call that secular deflation. Now, we haven't really observed that over the course of our economic history. We generally observe some inflation. So what must that mean? Our economy has been growing, that's for sure. So we definitely have a long-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. So how is it that we are experiencing inflation if that's the case, right? Well, it must be that at the same time, aggregate demand is also shifting to the right by at least the same amount, if not a little bit more, right? So if it shifts by the same amount as the aggregate supply curve, long-run aggregate supply curve, then we would basically have a price level that remains constant. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one thing that can shift the aggregate demand curve to the right is increasing the money supply, which is, again, monetary policy, a part of monetary policy, which we're going to talk about towards the end of the term. But that's basically what's happening. As our economy grows and long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right, aggregate demand is also shifting to the right at the same time. And since we experience inflation, it's actually shifting a little bit faster to the right than long-run aggregate supply is. Okay, so here we see secular deflation as the result of economic growth. But it must be the case that since we experience inflation and not deflation, it must be the case that aggregate demand is also shifting to the right by at least the same amount as long-run aggregate supply, if not even just a little bit more. Okay, so what if there are steady prices and there are what if there are steady and sustained decreases in the price of key inputs in the production of energy? All right, well, such changes enable firms to produce more goods and services at any given price level, right? Basically, cheaper input prices means that firms in the economy can make more, they can produce more. And what that also means, therefore, is that the amount of real GDP produced at each possible price level increases, and this is basically economic growth, right? So the nation's long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right as a result of this. So fortunately, we might be experiencing that to some degree with the decrease in oil prices and gas prices right now. Okay, let's take a look at inflation rates in the United States going all the way back to 1960. So as I mentioned, our economy, for the most part, almost always experiences some inflation. It's usually around 2%. But it has been higher at certain decades. So in the 70s and going into the early 80s, it was up above 4%, which is pretty high historically for the United States. We're generally around 2 to 3% inflation. And then in the last 10 years, since the Great Recession, it's actually been even below 2%. So we've been around 1%, maybe even a little less inflation in the last decade or so. So it's pretty interesting.